Could you talk a little bit about the status of the Middle East hostage and ceasefire negotiations?
I could, but it's moving hour by hour, and I haven't gotten an update in the last several hours. What I would say is that the negotiators are bearing down on the details, meaning that we have advanced the discussions to a point where...
So Joe Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, or shall we say Israeli Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, was in China this morning when he spoke to media. Except for one reporter, every other media representative appeared keen to ask about Chinese officials' body language and tone and American officials' proficiency in the Chinese language. Very newsworthy questions indeed. That's the level of reporting we have these days. You have got access to the National Security Advisor of the US, and you can ask him all kind of penetrating questions on America's complicity and active participation in the ongoing genocide in the Middle East. But what do they ask? They ask these very, very difficult questions.
Welcome to Beijing. My name is Laura Bicker. I'm from BBC News. I'd like to ask you talk about a call between the two leaders within the coming weeks. Will there be a last meeting between President Biden and President Xi? And also back to those talks with General Zhang, how important is it for you to have those talks with a leading general, and what was the tone of those talks?
China Media Group speaking. So we noticed that almost all of your accompanying staff can speak Chinese. So do you think this helped you to communicate with your Chinese counterparts? And does this help you accurately understand China's core concerns?
Thankfully, there was one reporter from Reuters news agency who sought Sullivan's attention to the Middle East. And I'm glad he did, because this truly exposed the lies of Sullivan and the rogue administration that he's been representing. And I'll explain what I mean here. Sullivan was asked a pointed question on the status of ceasefire talks. The reality is that there are no ceasefire talks. They have failed, and Antony Blinken had to return empty-handed last week after his failed visit to Israel, Egypt and Qatar. Why? Because he couldn't convince war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu to do one thing: that do not insist on occupying parts of Gaza as part of the ceasefire talks. He spoke to Netanyahu behind closed doors for 3 hours, and he could not convince him on this. And yet Sullivan this morning had the audacity to claim that ceasefire talks were moving in the right direction. Notice his discomfort while he attempts to push these lies. He was uncomfortable, obviously, because he knew that there was no such talks. That's because war criminal Blinken has disgraced himself by being a hugely compromised peacemaker, and Hamas doesn't take him seriously. Even US allies Qatar and Egypt do not appear keen to trust Blinken. Anyway, watch Sullivan and his lies here.
Thanks, Trevor Hunnick at Reuters. Jake, could you talk a little bit about the status of the Middle East hostage and ceasefire negotiations?
I could, but it's moving hour by hour, and I haven't gotten an update in the last several hours. What I would say is that the negotiators are bearing down on the details, meaning that we have advanced the discussions to a point where it's in the nitty-gritty. And that is a positive sign of progress, but at the end of the day, nothing is done until it's done, and so we're just going to keep working at this until we finally get the ceasefire and hostage deal across the line. And I'll have the chance when I get on the plane to check in with our negotiating team who's participating in these talks in the region even as we speak.
Just like his other colleagues in the Biden administration, Sullivan too has been a serial liar. In May, if you remember, in May, he traveled to Israel to meet Netanyahu and other Israeli government members. His trip was widely promoted by the US administration, saying that he was in Israel to warn Netanyahu to not enter Rafah. This is what he had told the media after he came back from Israel.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jake. 200 trip over the weekend to Israel and Saudi Arabia. A senior administration official said yesterday that Israel has addressed many of the U.S. concerns regarding its operation in Rafah. 900,000 plus civilians have fled Rafah in recent weeks. Has Israel addressed all of the administration's concerns? Does the U.S. support what Israel is doing in Rafah right now?
We had detailed discussions on Rafah during my visit to Israel. These have built on weeks now, as I've discussed with you from this podium, of discussions on a professional basis about Rafah and about how Israel can achieve the defeat of Hamas everywhere in Gaza, including in Rafah, while minimizing civilian harm. I explained to the Prime Minister and other senior Israeli officials the President's clear position. I reiterated that position. I was briefed by Israeli officials and by Israeli professionals on refinements that Israel's made to its plans to achieve its military objectives while taking account of civilian harm. What we have seen so far in terms of Israel's military operations in that area has been more targeted and limited, has not involved major military operations into the heart of dense urban areas. We now have to see what unfolds from here. So we will watch that, we will consider that, and we will see whether what Israel has briefed us and what they have laid out continues or something else happens. And one of you asked me the last time I was standing at this podium, how are you going to judge this? And I said that there's no mathematical formula. What we're going to be looking at is whether there is a lot of death and destruction from this operation or if it is more precise and proportional. And we will see that unfold. And we will obviously remain closely engaged with the Israeli government as we go.
The clown here talked about minimizing civilian harms at a time when Israel had just massacred more than 45 displaced civilians in its first attack by burning their tent. What kind of inhuman, monster, savages you have to be that you burn the tents of refugees? You call yourself the most moral army? America calls itself the most civilized country, and America was providing the weapons to go and kill the displaced civilians and refugees by burning their tents. This is what had happened. Several babies had their heads blown off. The State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller had defended, mind you, he had defended Israeli genocide then by saying that a shrapnel had flown and covered a distance of 1.5 kilometers to burn the tent and kill 45 innocent people, as if that shrapnel was practicing for Olympics. I mean, just see the kind of idiocy we are dealing with, the kind of criminals posing as senior officials of the US government that we have been dealing with. If there was any justice, all these posh-looking thugs, petty criminals, should be languishing in jails for the rest of their life. On 15th of August, exactly 15 days ago, Blinken's another minion, the State Department's Vedant Patel, he too had repeated these lies, that the administration can't share any specific progress on peace talks, except that now parties were discussing the implementation of details mentioned in the ceasefire talks.
Thank you, Vedant. Very quickly, on just following up on my colleagues on the talks. I mean, what is really perplexing is the fact that the president laid out the plan on May 31. You guys took it to the Security Council, UN Security Council. You got a resolution and so on. Why is there a need to have more talks? Why can't you just find a mechanism to implement what you have already agreed to with the rest of the world?
So for anybody who's actually probably been part of a negotiation process, it's probably not perplexing at all. This is a process. It is a complicated process, and as I said to Sean, and as Admiral Kirby said just an hour ago at the White House, the focus now is working on the details of the implementation and details of execution and specific implementing measures. There is no question as it relates to the contours that President Biden laid out at the end of May. That was then quickly supported by the international community, including the UN Security Council and much of the Arab world. And it is the contours of the plan that was echoed last week in the trilateral statement by President Biden, the Emir of Qatar, and the President of Egypt.
Patel's boss Blinken invented a new term altogether. when he landed in the Middle East on 18th of August. He stopped calling it ceasefire proposal that Joe Biden had proposed on 31st of May. Instead, Blinken began to call it bridging proposals, whatever that means.
Now, as I think everyone remembers, President Biden put out a detailed plan for a ceasefire and the release of hostages in May. The entire world endorsed it. The UN Security Council endorsed it. And since then, we've been working to bring the parties along with it. A lot of work went into that, and we got to the point where, as we were working on implementing that plan, it was necessary hearing from both the parties to provide some clarifications, to provide some additional detail, and that's exactly what went into the bridging proposal that our three countries put forward just a little over a week ago.
That's how serious these idiots have been in achieving peace in Gaza. Only fools will believe that the US administration would want the slaughtering of innocent Palestinians, women, children, babies by Israeli terrorists stopped. The madness will stop today if the US decides to not sponsor this genocide, and together with Israel, it agrees to honor international laws. In a sense, the US agrees to behave like a law-abiding country and not a rogue nation. That's it from me. I'm ever so grateful by your support for this journalism on buymecoffee.com and Patreon. If you think that this journalism is worth supporting, then you can also buy me a coffee or support me on Patreon. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.